To the brown bag. Today we have a guest from the Naval Medical Research Unit here in Dayton. He's LCDR, Brennan D. Cox, PhD. Welcome. Thank you for coming. And whenever you are ready, please start.
Okay, yeah, great. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Again, thank you for this opportunity to discuss with you some of the work that I've done that relates to your programs of study. I was told that I'd be speaking with some folks in an industrial and organizational psychology program, maybe a human factors engineering program. And so I've titled this talk, Applying Human Systems Integration to Optimize the Naval Aviation Selection Test Battery. Next slide. So I'm dialing in on Wright-Patterson Air Force Base right now. I am a government employee, active duty Navy, but I do have this legal disclaimer that the views that I'm going to express today are my own. Next slide. All right, I'm hearing some people still dial in, so let me just start off a little bit slow with an introduction. Again, my name is Brennan Cox. I am an active duty industrial and organizational psychologist. So I received my PhD from Auburn University in 2010, where I studied primarily the assessment of individual differences for the purpose of personnel selection. I defended my dissertation on a Friday, and that very next Monday, I was in the Navy and undergoing officer development school in Newport, Rhode Island. Followed by a year of flight training in Pensacola, Florida. Please back a slide.
Excuse me. Yeah.
There we go. Yep. So I did a year of flight training in Pensacola, Florida, and that's where I earned what we call aeromedical wings of gold, an aeromedical warfare designation as Naval Aerospace Experimental Psychologist number 142. Now, if you've never heard of the aerospace experimental psychology community, I'm not surprised. AEPs are a small community of about 30 active duty scientists with backgrounds in non-clinical areas of psychology and human factors engineering. And the way that we serve our country is through research, development, and scientific management activities, primarily in support of naval aviation, but we are happy to and often called upon to apply our expertise to other DoD communities as well. And so again, I'm currently stationed here on Wright-Patterson Air Force Base as Deputy Director of the Naval Aerospace Medical Research Laboratory. And if you didn't know, yes, the Navy has a research lab here, co-located with the Air Force Lab on Area B. So if you're familiar with their centrifuge capability, you know where my building is. And while the Air Force has sort of their high-speed device that spins in circles, we have the one that also spins you upside down and forward and backward along 6 degrees of freedom. The disorientation research device, what we informally call the Kraken. But we also conduct research in altitude effects, acceleration, motion sickness, spatial orientation, fatigue, neck and back pain, vision. We have a very broad portfolio. There are 6 active duty scientists in my directorate and about 70 DoD civilians and contract personnel to give you an idea of the scope of our activities. I did want to provide just a quick summary of my military career up to this point, viewed across the bottom of the screen. You see I started out in Pensacola, Florida as a division officer in the operational psychology department. This was a 6-person shop responsible for managing the Aviation Selection Test Battery, or the ASTB, which is effectively the SAT for naval aviation and the main topic of my talk today. Following that tour, I moved to the West Coast, first to San Diego, where I conducted research in the Warfighter Performance Department of the Naval Health Research Center, doing boots-on-the-ground studies with Special Warfare and Marine Corps units. And then I promoted to the head of research operations, so I had oversight of all command research activities, including the IRB, the library, as well as the authored works production unit. So I spent 3 years there and then transitioned northward to the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, where I served as an assistant professor of human systems integration. So again, if you didn't know, the Navy not only has the Naval Academy for their undergraduate degrees, but also the Naval Postgraduate School for master's and doctoral programs. And the faculty there are a nice mix and match of active duty and civilian personnel. And my community is fortunate enough to have a standing teaching appointment there, which was a big selling point for me joining the Navy as an aerospace experimental psychologist. So that's the quick summary. So as you can see, I served in a variety of ways as an applied program manager running the Aviator Selection Shop. I've served as a scientist with bench-level research and operational studies, and I've completed a tour in academia as an assistant professor, all while serving under the same umbrella organization with some of the best benefits and some really incredible experiences working with a variety of warfighters in the air, underway at sea, and on the ground with some of our special warfare units. And while those things are not the focus of my talk today, I would certainly be happy to address any questions at the end on what it's like to serve as an active duty scientist in the aerospace experimental psychology community in particular, as well as what opportunities are available to collaborate with the DoD for non-clinical psychologists and human factors professionals. Again, my talk today is on the application of human systems integration toward the optimization of the Naval Aviation Selection Test Battery. Before I get started, how many folks on the line have heard of HSI? How many of you have heard of human systems integration? I don't want to make any assumptions. So, all right, I see a hand going up, but I can't see everybody. All right. Go ahead and next slide, please. Again, if you were a little late dialing in, I encourage you to use the chat box. I'm also open to interruptions, so if you want to chime in, that's completely fine by me. We can make this as interactive as you like. But I do have a little introduction here on human systems integration for those who are not familiar. It can be defined a number of ways. The definition that I use here is based largely on the one that we use through the Naval Postgraduate School's Human Systems Integration Program Office. And so formally defined, HSI is an interdisciplinary approach to system design and management that accounts for human capabilities and limitations and recognizes that optimal system performance often requires trade-offs to balance cost and schedule and risk parameters. And these trade-offs occur across the variety of human dimensions that you can see listed in the sub-bullets here. This is manpower, personnel, training, human factors, safety, survivability, habitability, and occupational health. Now, in the DoD, human systems integration professionals really work to ensure that any time that we acquire or build a new complex system, like the Joint Strike Fighter or like an unmanned underwater vehicle, right, that the characteristics of the human user are taken into account. Because all too often, our engineering teams can get caught up in the technical requirements and pushing the envelope on what can be done, that they may overlook or fail to consider what should be done based on the physical and psychological characteristics of the user. And so HSI experts take this perspective into account and collaborate with engineering teams to improve upon the user experience and ensure that we're able to adequately select for staff and train the right mix and match of personnel to operate, maintain, and otherwise support these types of programs. And so if you've never heard of it before, again, I didn't want to make any assumptions, but HSI is going to provide the framework through which I'll describe how we developed and optimized the Aviation Selection Test Battery during its most recent revision, which I'll get to in a moment. But first, some trivia. And so if you can go to the next, there we go. And yes, Barbara, I have a speakerphone, but it's I don't want to deviate from what I have now. So I'm going to keep this hands-on headset for now. So this is a question to the group. Wright State. Perhaps a softball question based on your namesake, but Who knows the mechanism by which the Wright brothers first determined who should be the first one to fly? All right, at its essence, this is a personnel selection question. So does anybody know? All right, I see wait from Tyler. Good, but no. Anyone else? Taking a stab. Who was the oldest? That's good. Physical dimensions. These are great answers. In an era of fact-checking, right? I'm sure someone can tell me if this is true or folklore, but my quick and dirty research on the topic tells me that a coin toss, a literal coin toss, decided which of the two Wright brothers would be the first to take flight. And so there you have it. The first aviator selection test was based on a coin toss. And of course, we quickly learned that there are better ways of going about making these types of determinations. So next slide, please. So in the years to follow, and this is where some of your feedback comes into play, the first large-scale aviator selection program became based primarily on the medical examination. So doctors were providing the screening to determine whether a candidate had the appropriate physical stature, strength, stamina in order to fly. And by World War I, doctors were performing these assessments, on visual acuity, hearing acuity, circulatory functioning, movement of limbs, health history, physical dimensions, things like you all put in the chat box there. These elements derived from aviators at work provided the foundation for the modern flight physical exam that's actually used by all military services today. And while no doubt valuable, right, it was soon determined that this flight physical examination alone was insufficient because some of these physicians were found to disqualify upwards of 90% of candidates, and then those who actually made it through would then enter a training program that was characterized by exceptionally high and very costly accident and attrition rates. And so clearly something more was needed to select our aviators. Next slide, please. And so as World War II approached, we actually saw aviation selection research experience a boom, if you will, led largely by the Civil Aeronautics Authority, which is the predecessor to our modern-day FAA, funding the 1,000 Aviator Study, in which a team of psychologists evaluated about 60 psychological, physiological, and psychomotor tests for their ability to predict success in naval flight training. And the findings of this study helped produce the very first comprehensive battery of selection tools for screening aviation candidates, many of which are still found today in the Naval Aviation Selection Test Battery. Next slide. And that brings us to the topic du jour, the ASTB, the primary tool for assessing and selecting student pilots and flight officers into the Naval Aviation Training Program for the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Marine Corps, and the U.S. Coast Guard. And variants of the ASTB have actually been around since World War II and that 1,000 Aviator Study, and until recently, this test battery consisted primarily of cognitive ability tests, administered in a paper and pencil format. So there was math, reading, and mechanical comprehension, multiple choice items, as well as a picture-based spatial apperception test in all versions of the ASTB up until very recently. For the past few decades, around 10,000 candidates would take the ASTB each year, and they're allowed to take it up to 3 times if they don't score well on their initial attempts. And so when it was in paper and pencil format, there would therefore be 3 different versions of the ASTB, versions A, B, and C, and these were maintained in each of the naval recruiting offices. and that meant Navy recruiters were responsible for test administration, as well as for securing the test booklets to ensure that they didn't get lost or fall into the wrong hands. Now, this is one of those cases where a few bad apples spoil the bunch, because believe it or not, it turns out that some of our Navy recruiters took it upon themselves to become ASTB test coaches in lieu of being test administrators. And some of these recruiting offices were found to be submitting improbable, if not impossibly high scores, suggesting the overall battery had been compromised. And this observation served as the impetus for the ASTB modernization effort to create its current form, ASTB Series E. Everybody tracking? Next slide, please. All right. ASTB-E builds upon its predecessor models by introducing a number of advanced features. First, we went entirely computer-based and online administration. So all those paper and pencil copies, they became obsolete. And this mitigated several of our test security issues and also opened the door for some new capabilities. So for instance, with the introduction of computer-based testing, we were able to implement a computer adaptive testing engine, which updates the delivery of the test items based on whether the candidate answered that item correctly, or the previous item correctly. So a computer adaptive testing format, which not only provided gains in test security, but also in testing efficiency. So if you study item response theory in your program, this is one of the very fine products that come out of that version of our statistics. The computer-based tests also provided for immediate scoring. So no more concerns over tests getting lost in the mail or last-minute applicants missing their deadline. And it also gave our office in Pensacola, where we oversee the ASTB program, real-time insight into how many tests are being administered by each of all the 300-plus testing centers, and what the score profiles look like across our candidate regions or populations, as well as a whole host of other oversight capabilities. So the test changed and how the ASTB was being administered, as well as how it was structured. But what about the content? And as you can see, in the overhaul to create ASTB Series E, we maintained our primary assessments of cognitive abilities, again, math, reading, mechanical comprehension, which actually contribute to the bulk of our prediction models. But we also added a personality assessment and a series of psychomotor tests. And so for the next few slides, I'll introduce you to these tests so you have some understanding of what the content of the ASTB looks like. Next slide.
So Brennan, can I interrupt for a second?
Sir. Yeah, please.
So you're mentioning predictive models. Can you speak a little bit about how these instruments were validated?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's I'll touch on this in a few slides, but we in Pensacola there's the training pipeline takes place there. That's where all naval aviators start their career, and prior to beginning training, they are stashed there. So it could be days, weeks, even months, where there could be hundreds of qualified student aviators awaiting training, and they volunteer to participate in our validation efforts. And so whether we develop content on our own or we contract support out for agencies to help us develop content, we can validate it against this pool of folks who are awaiting training. And then we also use scores from the training pipeline concurrently to evaluate how our test content maps onto performance and training. So that's sort of like a quick summary of how we do it, but I'll go into a little bit more detail for you. And if I don't fully answer your question by the time I get through the ASTB content, please let me know and I'll speak to it a little bit more.
Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. Okay. So again, for ASTB-E content, the new stuff. First, we incorporated a personality assessment, and this was based on a job analysis exclusive to naval aviators. And 9 traits were identified in this process. And for this one, we contracted out to an item writing specialist group to produce upwards of 300 unique items per trait. And from these, we created prototype tests and administered those to students awaiting training, with each test being completed by at least 500 folks. And these volunteers not only completed the experimental items, but also rated each item on their overall desirability. So how favorable is this item on the trait dimension, or unfavorable is it? Data from those prototype tests, they were analyzed to obtain item psychometric properties required to support their use in our computer adaptive delivery engine, which ultimately produced the NATFI, the Naval Aviation Trait Facet Inventory, which is our forced choice adaptive personality test that uses multi-dimensional item pairs that are matched on ability as well as on social desirability. And so as the sample items shown here suggest, candidates are given a choice to select which of the 2 statements is most representative of their feeling, thoughts, or their behaviors. And each statement corresponds to one of the 9 traits, and each item pairing is generated from the overall pool of available items in a computer adaptive fashion. So some of these items are going to be flattering. So you see the first set here, I am confident, I am capable, both very flattering types of statements, but in some cases candidates must select from 2 unflattering statements. So you can see the unflattering statement pairs at the bottom there. So that's kind of a sampling of what our personality assessment looks like. It's not the traditional Likert style response scale, but instead an adaptive forced choice personality test. Next slide, please. Okay, the other new measures that we built into the ASTB were performance-based, requiring the use of headphones as well as hands-on stick and throttle devices, which connect through the USB ports of the test administrative computer. This series of measures assesses a variety of skills and abilities, including processing speed, spatial ability, divided attention, working memory, and multitasking. And there are 4 subtests that I'll speak to. These are the direction orientation task, dichotic listening, airplane tracking, and emergency scenarios. So next slide. Great. So here you'll see the description of the direction orientation task and the dichotic listening task. Over on the left side, the direction orientation task is what we use to replace the spatial apperception test from previous versions of the ASTB, but the general assessment of mental rotation ability remained the same. So for this test, as you can see on the image on the left side, candidates are shown 2 map pictures. The first one shows an aircraft flying in one of the 4 cardinal directions, with north always oriented to the top of the map. And then the image on the right shows 4 parking lots that are oriented based on the aircraft's field of view. So candidates are instructed verbally using their headphones to target one of the 4 parking lots, and based on the heading of the aircraft on the left map, they must select the appropriate image on the right. So in this case, you see there's an aircraft on the left side, it's heading south, and so the candidate is instructed to target the north lot, and so they got to demonstrate their spatial awareness by selecting the parking lot most directly in their flight path. And they are scored based on their accuracy as well as their response time. Over on the right side of the slide, you'll see our dichotic listening task. Again, candidates are conduct this test while wearing headphones, through which separate streams of letters and numbers are read aloud in each ear. And they're instructed to attend to one ear or the other and perform a command like depressing a trigger on the control stick anytime a particular digit is read aloud. So for instance, an even number read aloud in the left ear. They perform this task on its own as well as in conjunction with the airplane tracking task. Next slide. So here's the airplane tracking task on the left side of the screen. It presents a relatively simplistic video game, like Atari era, for those who are into retro gaming, right? Candidates complete this test using the stick and throttle devices in a progressive sequence of testing. So first, they use the throttle only, and they have to align the crosshairs atop an aircraft that's moving along a vertical axis only. So if you look at the black picture there, left of the yellow line is sort of the vertical axis. They try to align those red crosshairs atop the yellow aircraft using the throttle device. Next, they use the stick controller only, and they have to chase the aircraft that's on the right side of that yellow line, and it moves in all directions. Then, to get at multi-limb coordination, they perform both the stick and the throttle chase sequences concurrently, being scored on their average distance to each target, as well as the number of times that they're able to maintain the crosshairs atop the bogey for a short period. This is what we call hits. So it's very challenging, I assure you. Over on the right side of the screen, for the last of the performance-based tests, this is an assessment of working memory as well as performance under stress. Candidates are given instructions on what to do in the event of 3 different emergency scenarios. So for instance, a fire warning or an engine light. Each of the emergencies has a 3-step procedure to make it go away. So it might be rotate button A, flick switch B, and then depress the trigger to resolve a propeller emergency. After a brief exposure to those instructions, they're sent into the dual airplane tracking task, and during that trial, each of those 3 emergency scenarios is presented, and the candidate must recall and perform the correct emergency procedure while also doing the stick and throttle tasks. Having done this several times myself, I can fully attest that it is as stressful as it sounds. And then if you put yourself in the shoes of a candidate in a high-stakes selection setting, very, very stressful. All right, so I'll pause here to see if there are any questions related to the content of the ASTB, and then we'll go into some of the developmental challenges that we resolve through the application of HSI principles. So any questions on ASTB content? So if, I don't know if anybody's raising their hands. I can't see anybody's video. I am looking mostly at my slides, but also the chat box. So if you want to ask a question, the chat box is good, but you're also welcome to chime in if you have audio capability.
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself and speak directly.
Okay, well, if again, if there aren't any questions on ASTB content, I'll then dive into how we developed it and some of the things that we came across then. So next slide, please. All right, so you didn't ask any questions, but I know the question on everyone's mind is, what does this ASTB business have to do with human systems integration, right? So I'll be happy to tell you, first with this quick refresher, HSI, or human systems integration, is a process of identifying trade-offs that exist among the human and the technical components of any complex system. Now, I'm a fan of this tongue and groove or lock and key model here, where we can see human capabilities and limitations marrying up with technological affordances and constraints, with each filling in the gaps of the other in order to arrive at an optimally integrated total system. Now, as a personnel selection tool, the ASTB naturally aligns with the personnel domain of HSI. However, the update to create ASTB version E involved applications of human factors engineering, manpower training, as well as safety, which is where I'm going to spend the rest of this talk today. So next slide, please. We'll begin with human factors engineering. And I'll go ahead and say this. If you're an IO psychology person like myself, if you're into developing personnel selection tools, especially those involving modern or advanced technologies, I implore you, make sure that you have a human factors expert on your team. Our shop, we were fortunate to have such an expert temporarily stashed in our department at the time that we were updating the ASTB, and he jumped at the opportunity to bring to our attention several design features that we would have otherwise overlooked, given our sort of explicit focus on psychological assessment. But if he hadn't pointed those out, there would have been tremendous confounding influences on our test in terms of the experience and also the test scores had these things not been addressed prior to release. And so I'm going to share with you just a few of those here so you get a flavor of what I'm talking about. So as I've mentioned, the ASTB revision transitioned the test from paper-based to computer-based administration. And with that, the 300-plus test administration sites all turned in their paper booklets and had to verify their ability to deliver the new computer-based test. And while all the testing centers had internet-capable computers available, not all of those devices were the same, especially when it came to monitor size, which influenced the performance of our airplane tracking task in particular. So think about it for a moment. How might monitor size influence your ability to use a stick and throttle to chase miniature airplanes flying around? Right? Consider not only the size of the screen, but also the shape of the monitors. Because some of our test administration sites were using desktop computers, while others had laptops. Some had a standard monitor size, while others had wide screens. And with a task based on trying to minimize the distance of a moving target, how do you control for those differences in monitor and display settings to ensure that nobody is given an unfair advantage or is unfairly disadvantaged? The way that we resolved that was by developing a calibration tool for each test administration site. But in doing so, we needed a calibration device. We needed a sizing device that folks would have on hand no matter where they were located in the world and without adding, additional costs to this program. All right, so what did we use? What does everyone, at least in the military, tend to have with them at all times? Anyone's guess? A coin. That's good. Yeah. A coin is a great guess, and that's not what I'm going for, but I appreciate it, Lori. Yeah, there you go, Tyler. The Common Access card, a CAC card, an ID card, right? So it could be a military ID, but it could also be a driver's license. It could even be a credit card. All of these, you can take them out of your wallet now. All of them are designed according to a standard ID card size. And so to calibrate each of our testing stations, we had our test administrators actually hold their standard ID card up against their screens and then use their mouse to pull the size of a digital box to align with the size of the card. And then we had an algorithm we developed in-house that would calibrate the presentation of the ASTB's performance-based measures according to the screen dimensions of that very particular display. So this was a human factors problem that we were able to solve in advance of going live with ASTB-E. Next slide. Another human factors challenge that we came across was with the initial supply of our control devices. So it took several years to develop ASTB-E, and throughout the development process, we were using the Thrustmaster Cougar, the stick and throttle set that you see on the left side. These control devices, if you've never used them before, are pretty heavy duty. They literally have extra weight built into them, in part to keep them from slipping and sliding across your desktop when in use. Their movement is also a little bit rigid, so it takes a bit of power to propel the throttle forward or back, or to move the stick around. Now, a year or two before release of ASTB-E, we began buying large quantities of the Thrustmaster control set. But then they stopped becoming available. I'm not sure if they were discontinued, but we couldn't find them anywhere. Right? And we hadn't purchased enough supply for all of our testing sites. So we did a search for comparable devices, and we found the SATEC control set that you see over on the right. Now, apart from the colors and the LED lights, there are some substantial differences in the position of the buttons, the knobs, the switches, as well as the overall feel and movement of these two control sets. Compared to the Thrustmaster, for instance, it takes a lot, relatively less force to actuate the stick and the throttle of the SATEC set. So what to do? Ultimately, because we developed the performance-based measures using the Thrustmaster control set, the scoring algorithms for the performance-based battery served as the Thrustmaster control set served as the primary for that. But we then had to create separate scoring algorithms for the SATEC devices. And then just to minimize or reduce the potential for advantage of using one control set versus the other, we ran an experiment with subjects completing the performance-based sections of the test using both devices, and using the data from those trials to build in small but meaningful corrections to effectively equate scores. We also built into the test administrator interface the ability to select which stick and throttle set was being used, which would then inform the appropriate scoring algorithm for that candidate. And so for any of the human factors folks on the line, you may be thinking, well, of course that's what you would do, but I'll tell you, we did not plan for those requirements initially, and it was really good fortune that we had someone available to advise our team on how we were setting ourselves up for failure by not taking those factors into account in advance. And so those were some human factors, engineering influences in how we developed ASTB-E. Any questions on the human factors engineering piece before we move forward? All right, sir, if you could advance, please. We'll next talk about manpower. So this involves identifying the appropriate number and mix of skilled personnel necessary to support any system of interest, in this case, naval aviation. So how many aviators do we need to make each year, and of what type? From the manpower domain, our office worked with Navy Personnel Command to ensure that ASTB scores effectively identified the most qualified candidates for aviation training without inadvertently screening out promising candidates. And this is not as straightforward as it might sound. As I've said before, the ASTB largely assessed cognitive abilities throughout its history. And what do we know about the use of cognitive ability tests in high-stakes selection? Anyone? Did they ever have unintended consequences, unintended outcomes? There you go, Corey. That's right. A review of our historical ASTB data showed evidence that white male applicants tended to pass the test and become selected into aviation training at disproportionate rates compared to women and racial minorities. Now with ASTB-E, we purposefully set out to avoid this outcome. Our focus was not only on identifying the right number of qualified candidates, but also the right mix. And so consideration was given toward introducing tests that increased the predictive power of our battery while also avoiding unintentional discrimination in the form of adverse impact. And I will say we were most pleased to discover that the addition of the personality tool as well as the performance-based measures actually led to increased passing rates for women and racial minority candidates, and it also increased the overall validity coefficients across all of our demographic subgroups. So a win-win-win in terms of adverse impact in the manpower domain. Next slide, please. Additional manpower decisions also influenced ASTB-E development, including the need for service-specific standards. So different cut scores for those applying to be a pilot or a navigator for the Navy, the Marine Corps, or the Coast Guard. So of the three services, who do you think has the highest standards? Anyone care to take a stab at this? All right, I see Tyler saying the Coast Guard. All right, good guess. The Marines. Yeah, actually, Nicholas, you're correct. So the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps set different standards than the Navy and the Coast Guard. The Navy and the Coast Guard had the same, but the Marine Corps wanted to set their standards a full stay-9 above what the Navy and the Coast Guard use. And so in this case, the minimum score requirements for Marines was about 10 percentile points higher than the other services. That may be a culture thing. I'm not quite sure the reason, but by golly, the Marines wanted the most qualified folks into their program. We also conducted analyses to determine the optimal number of lifetime attempts at the test, which we set at 3 based on longitudinal studies of depreciating gains across multiple test administrations. And we also developed policy for score waivers too. So what happens if a person retests and scores higher on one section but lower on another? And from an HSI perspective, this is where we really start to see trade-offs starting to occur. By setting score requirements, we set limits on the number of people who actually qualify each year. The cut score, therefore, needs to be set at such a level that we always have a sufficient number of folks in the training pipeline at any given time to meet our manpower needs. But we also need to make sure that we don't set the bar too low, such that we allow folks who lack the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities to fly and ultimately wash out of the training program. All right, one more question for the group. How much do you think it costs to train a single naval aviator? Let's get some guesses on the chat feature here. How much does it cost to train an aviator? A lot. That's right. Yes. Yes. Good. So just for basic flight training, it can cost about $1 million to train a single naval aviator. For advanced flight training, if you want to go fly the Joint Strike Fighter, that cost is going to increase about tenfold, about $10 million for one person. So it's imperative that we only allow folks in the training who have the propensity to excel and complete the program. Based on our analyses on the total value of the ASTB in terms of dollars and cents, we find that use of the test avoids about $55 million a year in lost training cost, which if you're an IO person, that's a huge bullet point to have on your annual performance evaluation in your first job out of grad school. Let me tell you, I was happy to say, yeah, that's what I did. Yeah, that's how we aim to validate the ASTB in terms of manpower is by reductions in lost training costs. Any questions on the manpower domain? All right, I have a couple more, so let's go ahead and keep moving on. We've touched on, next slide, please. We've touched on human factors engineering and manpower. So now let's take a look at training. This is relatively straightforward because the ASTB is validated against aviation training grades. And there's good reason for this, in that it can take well over a year for someone to complete flight training. And a lot of developmental experiences take place throughout that time period. So like how the SAT only predicts how well you'll do in freshman year of college, right? The ASTB is designed to predict how well a person will do only in the early phases of flight training. If you look at the image here, the ASTB predicts up to the blue diamond. This is before student aviators are assigned into their platform of being a jet or a helicopter or a multi-engine aviator. Our very first criterion measure predicts entry-level phases of training, which is actually not performed in the aircraft, but in the classroom. So all naval aviators begin their training in ground school instruction and a program that we call Aviation Pre-Flight Indoctrination. They take written tests on subjects like the fundamentals of aerodynamics, flight rules and regulations, weather patterns, engine systems, navigation. And their scores on those written tests feed into a single combined metric called the Navy Standard Score, or NSS. And to predict how well folks will do in this ground school instruction program, we actually created an ASTB scoring algorithm specific to that singular academic performance metric. And we created a score component we call the Academic Qualification Rating, or the AQR score. Okay, folks. You've learned about some of the content on ASTB-E. Of all the subtests that are in there, cognitive abilities, personality, psychomotor skills, which do you think are the most heavily weighted in the prediction of academic performance going through that component of the training? Cognitive. Awesome. I appreciate it. Yeah, cognitive ability, of course. Of course, the cognitive ability subtest of the ASTB is most likely to predict that academic sequence of training. But of course, aviation training is really about how well a student does in the air. And so we developed a second set of scoring algorithms for our primary phase flight training. As with the academic phase, primary phase flight training also consists of a variety of graded events that feed into a singular metric. And the ASTB produces two score components to predict those primary phase flight training grades. We derive the Pilot Flight Aptitude Rating, or the PFAR, and the Flight Officer Aptitude Rating, or the FOFAR. And in this sense, a candidate will know upon completion of the ASTB whether they are more qualified to pursue a pilot track based on their high PFAR score, or a navigator track based on their FOFAR score. All right. Based on what you know of the ASTB, which subtests do you think are most heavily weighted for predicting primary phase flight training performance? All right. Yeah, so this might be a bit of a trick question, right? Because I think, and it looks like you're tempted to jump to the stick and throttle or the performance-based tests, but actually, once again, the cognitive abilities still hold to be the strongest predictor of performance. And we tend to see this in the literature as well, though we are happy to say that scores on the personality test, as well as the performance-based measures, both add incremental validity for predicting primary phase training performance above and beyond cognitive ability, which again, we are most pleased to see in our validation studies. Next slide, please. Of course, predicting who will do well in training was only part of our focus in developing ASTB-E. We also wanted to avoid any false positives, that is, giving passing scores to candidates who had ultimately attrite or failed to complete training. To address this challenge, we gathered years of exit survey data completed by student aviators. Anytime that they completed a phase of training or anytime that they failed to complete a phase of training, they completed a survey. And what we found out from these data was that the #1 mechanism for not completing training, it wasn't physical or medical in nature, nor was it bad grades, and fortunately not a consequence of a mishap or an accident. The main reason a person fails to complete aviation training is voluntary attrition. They drop out of the program by request. And we have follow-up questions to ask, why they do that. And what we find from the content analysis is that they've either lost interest in that career path, they have family or personal issues, or they've discovered that the flight environment is too stressful, or that they just dislike flying in general. I can't really comment much on this because our personality traits are proprietary. We don't publish or make availability even the names of our 9 traits, let alone the items. But I will say that our personality test was designed in particular to target these types of attrition factors. And we've seen attrition rates go down as a consequence with the adoption of ASTB-E, which is a huge win. Any questions on training?
So what counts as flight failure in training?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
What counts as flight failure in training?
Yeah, flight failure. So there are standards. So there are clearly defined standards when you are flying. And if you deviate too far from those, the instructor pilot will grade your performance as not satisfactory. And too many of those can lead to a flight failure. In some cases, you're given opportunity to repeat events, but in others, it is a pass and fail type criterion. And so some people actually wash out for flight failure. Yeah, thanks for that.
And that is possible to measure only in training, right? You can't measure that when they fly real missions?
We haven't seen that quite yet. So you're talking about like simulated events. Sim grades are graded, and so yeah, you can actually fail a sim if you're flying in that. But the blue box that you see there, at least at the time that this was developed, was based largely on failure of in the air events. But in the years since, those simulated graded events are creeping into it as well. Yeah, thank you for that. Next slide. Yeah, to your question there, can we use the test battery to see red flags for participants that are selected and then address them in training? So we look at a person's individual grades are rarely looked at after they're selected in the training. The only time that they are looked at the individual level is if somebody is in danger of failing the program. So they will be brought into a counseling board. And among the things that they look at, one of them is the ASTB. And if there are red flags in their test battery scores, they'll pull in somebody from the ASTB office to consult on that. So if it turns out that there's some pattern in the responses that was unusual or atypical for somebody, they can explain that. Or they can say, hey, look, everything that this person had in the selection setting showed that they would be good to go, that they were going to be a high performer. And so other people on that board might weigh in and look at some of the other what we globally call human factors issues going on with that candidate. Do they have, something going on in their home life? Is it the pace of things? Could it be alcohol? Could it be any number of factors? So that's the only case where we look at an individual's score after they're selected into the program. Thank you for the question. For our fourth and final HSI domain, we have safety. And since that first Wright brothers flight decided upon by a coin toss, according to legend at least, we've come a long way in our aircraft technologies and in safety of flight procedures. And our mishap rates today are minuscule compared to the first 100 years or so of manned flight. But we are still crashing planes. And we've yet to achieve the goal of zero mishaps. And in our efforts to do so, our Naval Safety Center carefully analyzes every accident, every hazardous flight or mishap event to determine causal factors. And what the data show is that about 90% of them are directly attributable to human error, as opposed to something wrong with the aircraft, for instance. The Safety Center reports that most of those errors are skill-based, followed by decision errors, violations, and perceptual errors. Next slide. And so we introduced tests into ASTB-E to account for decision-making under stress. Now, I've already described this. The final subtest of the performance-based battery culminates in the most stressful experience, simultaneous stick and throttle aircraft tracking while resolving emergency procedures, with scores based on how close a candidate remains to those two targets and the speed at which they arrive at the correct emergency procedure. These are high workload events, and so we start to see increased variability in scores as a consequence, with some folks showing to actually do quite well under these pressures and others doing less well, sometimes failing to attend to one task or another, and at other times kind of shutting down completely and just doing poorly across all the scores that come out of this assessment. Our aim here was to identify candidates who excel under duress, who can perform decision-making tasks with high accuracy and low response latency, especially while engaged in other competing psychomotor or cognitive activities, as these are the very skills that are needed to excel as a naval aviator. Of course, if you work in the safety domain, it's a stretch for us to claim that there has been a reduction of mishaps across the naval aviation enterprise as a consequence of adding these assessments into our selection test battery. But we do believe that there is a strong argument to be made that these are job-relevant tasks and most certainly tied to the HSI safety domain as it relates to a mechanism to reduce human error. Next slide. All right, I know I'm almost out of time, so with that, I'll summarize with a walkthrough of the 5 HSI domains that were considered in the development of the ASTB Series E, which is first and foremost, again, a personnel selection tool. So within the context of HSI, the personnel domain refers to the knowledge, skills, and abilities necessary to successfully perform a job. Next, we have human factors engineering, which encompasses human-centric technical considerations in the design and evaluation of complex systems to reduce or eliminate design-induced errors. With manpower, we aim to ensure availability of the right people in the right place at the right time to get our jobs done. We took this into account in developing ASTB scoring algorithms, as well as service-specific passing criteria. Training, of course, is the means through which people acquire or enhance their knowledge, skills, and abilities. And ASTB-E was designed to predict how well candidates would perform in the aviation training environment. And safety, which is a huge priority in any high-risk job, as we try to aim to minimize the potential for mishaps or accidents or injury. Safety influenced ASTB-E development as we built in tests to challenge candidates to perform tasks and make decisions under stressful conditions. So altogether, we have the ways and the means by which HSI influenced the design of the Naval Aviator Selection Program. And so as I conclude my talk today, I'll just leave you with a nugget here with a message that collaboration across these areas of expertise or any multiple domains of study is going to be absolutely essential for designing and delivering efficient, effective, user-friendly programs for any complex system, such as those that we see throughout the DoD and other large organizations. And so it's absolutely my pleasure to get this opportunity to speak to you all today, to share with you my experience, and hopes that it will inspire a similar level of collaboration in the future. And so with that, my last slide just has contact information, and I'm happy to answer any questions for folks who want to remain on the line. Thank you.
Thank you, Brennan. Let's take one or two questions quick.
Hi, Dr. Cox. Thank you so much for coming and sharing with us. So one of the questions that I had was, do you ever look at perceptions of fairness of the test, maybe particularly personality test? Are there any negative reactions towards that, anything like that?
Yeah, there absolutely are. Candidates are informed in an instruction screen that they're going to be asked to endorse items that are unflattering, and they don't care for that option. But what we tell them is this is not designed to assess what you would do or how you actually are, but given the choice, which one would you most likely would be most likely indicative of your behavior, thoughts, or emotions. And so, yeah, a lot of them come out of taking that personality test quite frustrated. But the reason that we use that forced choice mechanism for assessing personality is this is a highly motivated population, people applying for flight training, and they look at any mechanism to gain a competitive advantage. And we've had Likert-style items assessing personality in previous versions of the ASTB, but they quickly got taken out of the test battery because everybody was responding the same. Everybody, the recruiters were actually coaching candidates to respond like Maverick. That was, and so everybody was like, super high risk, super motivated in their responses. And so, yeah, while there's a perception maybe of the forced choice personality test battery not being fair, we decided to go that way as a means of reducing the tendency for response inflation. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Corey?
So, I was interested in your dichotic listening test, right? So what I hear is military, at least the Air Force, might be moving towards a pilot also having drone and multiple people on a team, and that seemed, that dichotic listening seems to be like a selective attention type test that might become more important. Just, really, I'm just have a discussion point, in terms of you think that might be more, be an important test, what kind of criteria we might see with that test, or?
Yeah, actually, great question. So the ASTB is designed for manned aviation, and we looked at that as a potential test battery for our unmanned or unmanned air vehicle operators. And recently, in the last couple of years, actually, we completed a 5-year effort to develop the unmanned ASTB. And so there actually is a separate test battery for UAV operators that looks a lot at this divided attention, multitasking. So your monitor might be split into several screens, and you have to attend to multiple things at once, but also listening tasks as well. So you're absolutely right. The sustained attention and paying attention to multiple things at one time was identified as a critical aspect of a UAV operator's job, and those are going to be included in that test battery, which is we're still making efforts for it to go live, but it is built. Yeah, good question. Thank you.
I have a quick question. Is this instrument applied only at entry for selection, or can it be applied also throughout the career?
Yeah, this is a big headache for us because we'd like to look at long-term predicted power of the ASTB. At this point, it's only good through that primary phase of training. Intermediate and advanced flight training scores are actually harder to come by. The aviators leave Pensacola oftentimes for those phases of training, and so they become more distal from the ASTB office. And they also go to different training squadrons, and the standards are not always the same across those squadrons. So, some of them are for a jet population, others for, flying the big planes, the multi-engine, some for helicopters. We have tried to look at how we might use the ASTB to predict who's best fit for those different pipelines, but we haven't been able to get anything clean out of the data in the current version to inform those types of decisions, though that is what we're looking at for the next version of the battery. Yeah, thanks for that. Mm-hmm.
So we have to end here, but thank you very much for coming and taking the time to teach us about your work. We really appreciate it. And I encourage our students to contact you if they have further questions.
Please do. Please do. I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Hey, thank you, everybody. Good one.